IAA and Clear Channel today?
Yeah, you've hit a really interesting nail on the head there. So the question is, aren't the people who came up with the new business model the RIAA? Well, they are to a certain extent. In fact, that's the history of copyright. The history of copyright is yesterday's pirates become today's admirals, right? So just give me a sec, I'll get to you. So, you know, when the first record players were invented, the composers didn't think of performance as an important piece of the music industry. An industry is art plus technology. Anything else is just craft, right? So they had an industry, they had a printing press, so the composers could write sheet music and print it and sell it. Performers followed the instructions they wrote down, right? They were viewed as kind of trained monkeys. And so when the people started making record players that allowed a performer to perform a composition and then charge money for the recording, the composers went berserk. John Philip Sousa went to the Congress in 1908 and said, if these infernal talking machines are allowed to continue, man will lose his voice box as we lost our tails when we came down out of the trees. Right now, many points to Sousa for being an early advocate of the still controversial theory of natural selection, right? But he was wrong, right? It was good for the music industry as a whole to have this to have this piracy, right? To legitimize this piracy, to have a business model that legitimized it. Now, along comes radio, and the people who make records say, well, what we did was, what those assholes are doing with the radio, that's theft, right? You've got to keep them out of the market. And again, because Congress tends to be reluctant to be known as the elected lawmaker who broke the dominant form of entertainment in their country. I mean, there's a lot of bad things you can do to Americans and they'll re-elect you, but break their TVs and, you know, God help you, right? So lawmakers made radio legal, so the broadcasters now became the admirals. And along came cable, and what did cable do? Well, it stole broadcasts and put it down over the wire. And what did the broadcasters say? They said, those cable guys, they're pirates. What we did was progress, right? Well, then along comes the VCR. And the people who were the cable industry turned around, pointed to the VCR, and said, what those assholes are doing, that's piracy. What we did is progress. Now, who legitimized the VCR? Sony. Who put the rootkit on our computers? Sony, right? They're admirals now, and we're pirates. It's in the nature of copyright that the law never encompasses use invented when the law was written. That's because you've got to ship code if you're a lawmaker. You can't sit around and speculatively imagine all the things that someone might do with technology in art, right? If you were doing that, the heat death of the universe would precede the signing date of your code. You need to ship, and then you need to do a 1.1 release when the new technology comes along. And so historically, we do revise copyright law to accommodate new technology. The big difference today is that we have last year's admirals holding the line against this year's pirates. And this year's pirates need to understand that they are next year's admirals, and they need to fight for the legitimacy of the way that they acquire and use copyrighted works. Peer-to-peer networks are the largest libraries of human creativity ever assembled. They're the way that the majority of internet users consume art. To say that peer-to-peer networks should be stuck back in the toothpaste tube is not only unrealistic, it's immoral. What we need to do is figure out how minimize peer-to-peer. So one thing that's been widely proposed is that ISPs could opt into paying a license fee for their users that would confer on them the unlimited license for their users to download using whatever protocol and whatever software they wanted, any music they wanted, and that music would be statistically sampled and it would be paid back to artists. Now if that sounds familiar, it's because it's how radio works. No DJ picks up the phone and has his $400 an hour lawyer talk to the $400 an hour lawyer at Sony BMG to discuss whether this needle drop is going to cost 15 cents. They pay a blanket license fee, and in exchange they get the unlimited right to play music. Right? Well, why can't the American public get the same deal from the people who control those copyrights as the people who run radio stations? And why can't we get a better deal, right? Those old ASCAPs and BMIs, those collecting societies, were conceived of in an era when it was all pen and paper and really easy to make some money disappear. You know, you might have heard Sound Exchange can't find obscure artists like Public Enemy to pay them the royalties they owe them. Why can't we form collecting societies that look more like Flickr than like some back end at EDI, right? Where there's transparency, where it's really easy to figure out what's going on and where the money is going. And in fact, the International Music Managers Federation wrote a great paper called Characteristics of a 21st Century Collecting Society. It's basically a requirements document for that collecting society, that piece of software. I think we could really solve this deadlock. Instead of criminalizing tens of Americans instead of depriving them of their life savings, I think we could actually solve the problem. And if you go to EFF.org/share, you'll find some detailed proposals for this, including links to works by a professor at Harvard named William Terry Fisher, who's written a lot of great research on this. You know, if half the music fans in America were paying $5 a month for downloading their music, you'd triple the profits of the music industry, and we could portion that out not just to RIAA members, but to artists directly. You had a question? I hit it. Right. Dan, and then I think we got to wrap.
How do you connect your comments so far to around like open technologies and IP law to net neutrality?
How does this connect to network neutrality? Well, it's a good question. Network neutrality is a really thorny problem. You know, basically, we have a comparable situation to what happened with the broadcasters, where the network operators are, in the main, corporate welfare bums, right? They got a priceless treasure, the rights of way into our basements. Right? Imagine if you tried to individually license the right to run a wire into every house in America, what it would cost you, and how, not laying the cable, but negotiating the permission. Right? They got a law that allowed them to run the wire into our houses, and in exchange, we're supposed to get some value out of it. And what we're supposed to get is a neutral network. And what they're proposing, they're going to be able to charge high tariffs to some content providers instead of others. And the best example I've heard of it is Craig Newmark from Craigslist wrote a little piece that was quoted on CNN where he said, imagine if you picked up the phone and called, Massimo's Pizza down the block, and instead of connecting to Massimo's, you got a message that said, due to Massimo's is not paid for high quality of service and guaranteed delivery of its phone calls, you can either hold for 3 minutes or connect to our preferred Domino's. Right? That's the network neutrality fight in a nutshell. The problem is, I think, figuring out how to keep these guys in check. I'm not convinced that if we put the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission in charge of it, that we'd get a good outcome. Not because we shouldn't be regulating their ability to do this, but because those entities are readily captured by the industries they regulate. You know, the career trajectory of an apparat at the FCC, you get appointed when someone from your party gets into the presidency. You get appointed as part of the administrative turnover, and then when that presidency changes hands, the other party comes in, you leave and you go work for the companies who you've been giving sweetheart deals to through the whole term. And so those aren't people who are really good watchdogs on our behalf. There's one thing I do know, and it's that it's really hard to figure out whether or not a network connection is neutral. And we need that as a first step to whatever we're going to do, whether it's a market, a regulatory solution, or some kind of combination thereof. And right now it's really hard to figure out whether your ISP is fiddling your network. I just moved here from London. I now live in LA for a year. And there's a host in China that I could never reach. The reason I couldn't reach that host in China is Sprint had a year-old fiber break they were still advertising a route on. And Sprint provided BT Internet with its route to China, and BT Internet resold to my carrier, and so I couldn't get to China. Right? Neutrality problem, but it's still a problem, and it's opaque to the user. The only reason I could distinguish between this host being down and this host being and my network provider being screwed up is because the people in China kept emailing me this stuff and saying, we figured out what's going on, and here's a proxy you can use to route around it. What we need is a distributed tool that we can use to take the temperature of the internet from millions of different locations, something like the Storm Center, but more user-driven, more like the Google, something that lives on all of our computers and tests on different protocols, on different ports, to different hosts, how the internet is providing, and makes that data set public so that multiple people can take it and crunch it and produce it. It would be useful to know, even if your ISP isn't fiddling, if they're incompetent, before you sign up for them. And this is one way you could find that out. So I think we're out of time now. I'll leave you with another implication to join EFF, EFF.org. Thank you very much.